Okay, hi class. So I'm going to go over with you a little bit about your markers that you've got in your kit. So everybody has a different set of markers. These companies make multiple shades of gray. So what I have here are natural gray or neutral gray. Some of you have warm gray, some have cool gray. I think somebody has the same one as me. But these are all different, color palettes that this brand of markers called Copic makes. All of you also would have received three markers of the same color, so they'll all be neutral. They'll all be warm or they'll all be cool. And each of them will have a variation of how dark they are. So you might get a 10% gray, a 30% gray, and a 50% gray, or something like 20%, 40%, 60%. And what that just means is how dark they are. So 10% is the lightest, 100% is the darkest, and they just sort of gradually get darker from there. Before you start, make sure you've layered at least a couple of pieces of paper underneath because these markers bleed much more than a regular Crayola style marker. These are alcohol-based markers, which essentially means that once you've drawn on the paper, you can re-wet them over and over again to continue to blend them into other markers. If you look at like a regular Crayola, they don't blend. They just will, layer color on top of color. But these markers can actually be blended, which is what's so great about them. These markers have two tips. There's a square tip and a brush tip, and you can see that they create a little bit of a different style. The brush tip is much softer, and the square tip is more rectangular and sharper. These markers do bleed a good bit more than a regular marker, so if you're really precise and a perfectionist, don't be upset if you have a little bit of bleeding outside of the lines. As you can see below, what I'm doing is I'm layering up the color. So from left to right with each of my brush strokes, I'm actually adding more darkness to each layer of color. Versus a regular marker, which when you put down the color the first time, it's essentially as dark as it's going to get. And you can even draw from the back to make the illustrations a little darker, and then there's where you can see it bleeds onto the next page, so just make sure you've got extra paper. So what I can do with these three colors is I can actually continue to layer them on top of one another in order to build up the color. So I'm starting with my lightest color here, adding the next color to it, trying to kind of create an ombre, going back to that original lighter color and blending them together, and then building my way up to the darkest color at the end. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and draw a little bit on my fashion figure and give her some shading as well, now that I've practiced a little bit on the page. What I want to do is that we have three markers in order to build up the color and have three shades of darkness. A soft shade, a medium, and then a darker one. So I always start with the lightest one first. I always have the drawing or the picture of the real person next to me, and I try to just recreate the shading that I see on that image. So she has some shading on her neck. There's some really heavy lighting that creates a really big shadow on her neck. We see a little bit of shadow underneath her arms and around, like kind of wrapping toward the back of her body, under her bust a little bit. And those are the first places I'm going to place some shadow. And remember, each time you layer this color, you can build the shadow in itself. So don't even feel like you have to move on to the darker tone at the beginning. You can just keep working with this light gray a couple times in order to build up the shadow. So last, I'm just going to continue to build up that color, jumping back and forth between my three markers. So I can continue to build up with the lightest tone and then add a little more of the medium in small amounts and then add more of the darkest tone as well. One last note is that you will notice that when you lay the color down on the paper, after a few seconds, it'll fade a little bit lighter than when you first lay it down. So don't be afraid if it shows up darker at first. After it dries, it fades a little bit.